Good morning. I've just been watching a couple of videos on determinism, not on free will, but on agency, subtly different. One by Anna Cantavad, which in terms of a response to one of Professor Anton's videos, which I've just finished watching, Corey, so I'm kind of full of ideas to do with communications technology and language and the difference and similarities between those kinds of errors, action errors, errors within performance, and biological errors, performance of what appears to be a thinking agent, and errors in the performance of what seems to be a fully deterministic chemical process, let's say, what those might mean. Several things. It's fascinating stuff, this. Because as I said in the previous video, in the determinism light video, I think this whole frame of determinism or free will or determinism or agency are themselves kind of artifacts of the very thing they're trying to at least partially describe. It is rather like thought trying to describe its own processes with the limited language that thought has available. So, and of course that's going to throw up, not errors, but it's going to throw up translation artifacts, I think, something like that. Anyway, so that's my suspicion about what's happening here, but of course I may be way off. But several things come to mind. Several things are coming to mind in terms of a kind of image of what's happening here, which I've got, but also some thoughts to do with the history of these kind of things, the biological history, the evolutionary history of these things. Because one of my interests, as you probably know, Corey, is to do with things like motor cognition and how thought and mind, something like mind, would evolve in simpler organisms. And I'm not suggesting that would necessarily explain the kind of things that we're talking about now, but people like Rodolfo Linas, who I've mentioned before, who wrote The Eye of the Vortex, which is a really interesting take on all this, he and some of the other motor cognition people have some good ideas about this, I think. And basically what they're saying is they start from a description of very simple life forms. But life forms, crucially, that have what Linas calls motricity, the capacity to move. Even if it's in a really, really simple way that amoebas can move by extruding pseudopodia, or that hydra can kind of move to the extent they can just by changing the orientations of their processes. So really, really simple movement. Because if you have movement, that gives variable possibilities depending on, if you're sessile, if you don't move, then life is very simple. The journey of life is very simple. It's essentially chemical processes you're going through, not just more mechanical process. But if you can move, if you become motile, then there is the possibility that time will blow you into different places. You will move. You can move into different areas, or you will initially, without any agency or capacity to will yourself in any direction, that organism will find itself being taken to different environments, and will, because of that, be subject to different experiences, will survive or not survive depending on the environment which is born. And I know that the language I'm using here is terrible in terms of making sure agency is out there, but let's just do the best we can. It's quite early in the morning, about 10 to 6. So anyway, so you've got this idea of movement. And once you've got that, once you've got the possibility of variable survival according to the kind of location in space that the organism is shifted into, then with mutation processes taking place in the organism, you have the possibility of that organism being changed in a way which will affect its motion. So some organisms will become more subject to forces of motion. For example, the seeds of various trees, which start to acquire kind of feathery processes which allow them to drift further. Or you might even start to acquire biological attributes which allow you to, if not control that motion, at least have a more complex relationship to the forces which are making you move. So, for example, there's some seeds of oats, wild oats, which when they get wet, there's a little kind of stalk that sticks out, and the stalk bends because of its wetness. There's no muscles involved. It's a purely biochemical set of responses that's taking place in the fibre of the stalk itself. but it moves, and it makes the wild oat just move across the ground, just a few centimetres. But that's enough to drop it into a crevice or can be enough to drop it into a crevice in the ground, and as a result of that they're more likely to survive. So really, to take root. So really simple biochemical processes coming out of evolutionary processes which allow the organism to move, and because of that have variable survival possibilities. That's a really interesting moment, I think, in the development of cognition. And what Linas says is that those processes underpin much more complex processes that follow from that. Because once you've got that, you can just imagine advancing that forward a few million years to really simple creatures that have some capacity to scuttle around, but with just the brain as just some kind of command and control centre, which is just keeping the legs moving. Then again, that's going to have variable survival possibilities according to whether this creature scuttles into a cave when a predator's approaching, or whether it scuttles out into the open when a predator's approaching. And again, that survival possibility, based on its ability to move, it has an effect on the evolution of the animal itself. If the way that the DNA will code affects that. And then what Linas says, sorry this is taking so long, is that with a little bit of memory that really simple organisms can generate, a little bit of memory will allow some organisms not only to kind of remember the present that they're in right now, not only to be able to sense the experience that they're in right now, not only to have sensory experience, not conscious, but just be able to sense their present environment and to a certain extent their past environment, because that's what they are all doing. But we'll be able to start making predictions about what will happen if they take a step in that direction, as opposed to what will happen when they make a step in this direction. And it's not that the organism itself will be making predictions, not that they'll be thinking, I wonder what will happen if I move over there. It's that both those possibilities are simulated in the organism, and then one of those simulations is made real because it's the calculation is done kind of thing in a way which results in a positive outcome. So the organism simulates walking out into the sunlight, or simulates walking into a cave, sees what happens in both simulations, and then that simulation that results in a positive outcome, not being eaten by a predator, becomes realised as the organism walking into the cave. Again, nothing conscious going on there, they're just simulations. And then what he goes on to say, sorry, it's taking much longer than I anticipated, what he goes on then to say is that that out of those kind of simple actions, those capacity to simulate potential futures, which become more and more complex over time, more and more elaborate, more lengthy simulations, more variable, more multiple simulations, that out of all of those, what starts to evolve is the sense that there is a stable organism doing all these things. The organism itself begins to create an avatar of itself that it then runs through these various simulations. So the organism starts to create this I, which it imagines projecting into these futures, and feels itself, to a certain extent, surviving, not surviving, having a happy life, having a sad life. And it's this I which persists and which is held stable in all of these imagined possible futures. It's that I which, for us, we have evolved as the I inside that we have, the I that we feel is our ongoing identity, and that we can remember from the past, from having projected into various simulations, and from having made one of those simulations real, the thing that we call our own personal history. And that runs through all of this stuff. So it's not so much that it isn't so much there's an I which is making choices, it's that there are a series of simulations that the organism has created, and those simulations have created the I that has agency and keeps creating it on a moment-to-moment basis. Now I find that very attractive. I mean, I know it's epiphenomenal, it's suggestive that we are just an artifact, which I'm happy with, but I don't know, it's not perfect by a long shot, but I do like that because it records the sense of agency not as originating in some kind of transcendent being that has this kind of free will to make these choices, but these choices are part of a much more complex spatio-temporal set of processes which create the I and the agent and the sense of agency along with all of these other things. And of course some of those simulations might result in what we call errors. The organism might make a mistake, as we think of as a mistake, because it would be I don't know what you'd call that really. It wouldn't be an error in the great scheme of things, but at the scale of that simulation it would be an error. Anyhow, that's an image I quite like. One of the images that I have for this is not directly relevant to what we're talking about, but one of the things, because I just think this stuff is hard to wrap your head around personally, because as you say there, Corey, and as I think you said on account of that, we can't pretend we haven't got agency. Even I'm not a determinist as you know, or a free willist or whatever, but however we place ourselves, it seems to me incoherent to say that we don't have it, even if on some level we were to believe. Sorry, I just turned it off by mistake. As I say, even if on some level we were to believe that we didn't have any kind of agency in the world, and we were just ping pong balls, even if that's what we're just floating in a tsunami, even if we did believe that, I don't think we would find it possible to act like that. Our actions, our words constantly assert that we do seem to have agency and we do seem to have free will. Whether we say it's an illusion or not, and I don't like the word illusion very much, but that's the phenomenological world in which we operate. It does, the world out of lived experience does contain that, whether we however we frame it. It certainly exists to the same extent that things like pain exist or pleasure exist, doesn't it? I mean, it's on that, to me it's on that same level of experience. Pain doesn't exist in a universal sense, does it? It doesn't exist at the level of description of molecules. There is no pain, and at the level of description of stars there is no pain. It only exists at the level of description of biology, and that's also the level of description at which agency and free will exist. So it's about the appropriateness of that. I was going to say something about language, only to do with language being part of that kind of simulation possibility. When you simulate moving the pen across, or you project passing the pen from one hand to another there, Corey, that's the kind of simulation, isn't it? A kind of verbal simulation. This image I was thinking of, and this is just mine. What I imagine is a huge river, because rivers are some of the most complex things, aren't they? They're not complex in the sense that we don't know how they work. They're complex in terms of their predictability because of the chaotic forces within them. I imagine this huge river, but instead of a river of water, it's a river of like Meccano pieces and pieces of old clocks. This is just an image I've got in my head, and pieces of old computer parts. And it's just massive, great Amazon tide just flowing through the world, massive, and it flows for eons, and there's ripples and there's eddies in it and there's waterfalls, and it flows over rocks, all these tiny little computer parts and all these CPUs and all these little nuts and bolts and things, and they flow into eddies, and sometimes these things come together, so you get little tiny assemblies forming in some of these currents, and then they're swept away. And sometimes these little things that form are quite complex. In the great scheme of things, that's just about possible that these things could just come together in a way which, just assembles a toy car. So a little toy car runs around there for a while and then it's swept away. And sometimes these things get really complex. It might be an Amstrad, an old Amstrad computer might form or something like that. And that's just about complex enough to run a really simple program before it gets swept away. And these currents just keep assembling these different things randomly. And sometimes these currents get so complex they assemble machines which themselves contain little rivers of currents running through them. And those rivers form little machines inside them which buzz around the place for a while. and then those machines have machines inside those, and yeah, for within that kind of a nested network of complex thrown together machines, some of those machines might create simulations of the world in which they operate, and might create simulations of whereabouts in this little river they might be flowing, and what their actions will possibly be next in that great scheme of things. And sometimes those predictions will be correct, and sometimes they'll be incorrect from the perspective of their own processing. But it's all part of this great river, you know what I mean? Working at multiple levels of kind of machinic complexity. Anyway, that's possibly kind of irrelevant. It's just one of the images that I like. Great river of machinery. Anyway, that'll do for now. I mean, the key point is that agency exists, at least to the same extent that things like pain and pleasure exist. Probably for the same reasons that pain and pleasure exist. It doesn't make sense to say that one is real and the other is an illusion, to me. And to me, they're both bound up with the kind of biological, but also the social and the linguistic conditions of our existence. Thank you. 6:05.